Your socks.
Whoever's the project manager for Methane Mitigation Technology Division, Office of Resources.
Yeah, I'm trying to log in today with that, what's it called?
Before we get started, I just want to say thanks everybody for the invitation to come talk. I'll give you a quick bio. So my background is in geology. So I got my undergrad in geologic engineering at the Colorado School of Mines. Stayed there and did a master's in geology, and then I spent about 15 years working for Shell and then Cimarex down in Tulsa. I'm currently located here in Broken Arrow, even though I get to work for the DOE. So what's kind of cool is that this is a project that is right in my backyard as well. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the undocumented orphan well program that kicked off with the BIL funding that got passed in 2022. And it's been going for about a year. Excuse me. So to give you a sense of what the undocumented orphan well program and how it sits in the larger federal space of orphan well funding and amount of the money and the interest that's going on around there, is that we're sitting at the orphan UOW program is a $30 million program for 5 years, where we're tasked with the identification, characterization, and development of best practices for finding UOWs. At the same time, there are 2 other programs that we're trying to integrate and work with as much as possible. The one that you guys have definitely heard, I'm sure folks are aware of and heard of, is the Orphan Wells program, which is driven by the Department of the Interior, Orphan Well Program Office. I know the Osage won a grant, was it 20 or 30 million? I don't remember off the top of my head. But that's the large, the big $4.7 billion worth of funding out there for states, tribes, and others to plug orphan wells that we know about. And so we work directly and we're in contact with them at all times, because of course orphan wells and undocumented orphan wells are very similar, so having good communication is important. The other program, and I'll touch on this at the end, is the Methane Emission Reduction Program, or MERP. And this is targeted at conventional marginal wells that are near their end of life, right? So they're still producing, but they are getting to that point where they're uneconomic, and it's primarily targeted at folks that, they're small operators that the cost of plugging is prohibitive to them as well. That's part of it. That's the first phase. But it's a $1.5 billion program that is a collaboration between the DOE, the EPA, and METL. So just we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go down, but certainly if you have questions. So specifically, the undocumented orphan well program sits inside the DOE's fossil energy carbon management division, and then the subdivision of that is the Division of Methane Measurement Technologies. We have 3 other major components of DMMT. There's the methane emission mitigation, methane emission quantifications, and the decarbonization of natural gas resources. A lot of these are more focused in both upstream and downstream active production space, right? So we do a lot of work with measuring methane in active systems. There's a lot of work going on in the Permian, for example. But the one we'll talk about primarily today is the undocumented orphan well program. So again, this was kicked off in the BIL funding a couple of years ago, and it specifically calls out the DOE to be supporting states and federal entities as well as Indian tribes to develop methods and technologies and best practices for the identification and characterization of undocumented orphan wells. We're also charged with interacting with the IOGCC, which again is pretty prevalent here in Oklahoma. We have a $30 million budget over 5 years, and we've also received a $10 million budget through the fiscal year process. So this is kind of an ongoing, expected to be ongoing funding through the standard DOE budget. There are estimated, IOGCC estimated somewhere in 2021 that there's somewhere between 310,000 to 800,000 wells. If you read some other literature, this can easily exceed 1 million wells that are undocumented orphan wells. Okay, so I've said that word a lot. What does an undocumented orphan well mean? An undocumented orphan well is a well that doesn't even exist on the relevant regulatory bodies map for that area, right? So these are the wells that aren't even on the list, right? But we, especially places like Osage, you guys probably know where they are. You have some resources, some of them are, because they're in your backyards. But if you go to the maps, they may not show up on the official record. And those are the wells we're particularly interested in. Key partnerships in the undocumented orphan well process are the national labs, so we're engaging 5 national labs to help do a lot of this work. Of course, the IGCC through the states, and then, as I mentioned before, the DOI OWPO. So, our goal again is to really, if you can think about it, part of our goal is to help make that list of orphan wells longer, bigger, because that way you can get a better handle on the actual problem rather than have this big pile of wells that we're not entirely sure what the number is. So, like I said, it kicked off in late 2022. We just passed a year in terms of our work. So we are planning for a 5-year program. Right now, a lot of our work has been focused on data collection and kind of really defining the issue and the problem and how do we want to go about it, as well as already delving into some of the early technology and hardware deployments. And that's where, again, we'll get into our interaction with the Osage and some exciting things we're doing with that. There are 9 different work packages within our program, and if you guys are interested, we set up the Consortium Advancing Technology for Assessment of Lost Oil and Gas Wells, or catalog. We have our website up and running, so if you want to learn more about these things when I'm not up here standing, feel free. You can also contact me through that, so if you have other questions. But really, these are the major things that we are focused on in terms of addressing these wells. So first and foremost, because it's in the BIL legislation, we need to be able to measure and quantify the amount of methane coming off of any of these wells, because that goes into the prioritization process for how these wells, when these wells get plugged. Obviously, the emphasis is on the higher emitting wells, but we want to be able to measure, or at least get some sense of what all these wells are doing and where they sit in that space. Of course, well identification, somewhat self-explanatory, at least in an idea, but it's complicated in practice. It's using technologies of different sorts, both mining historical data as well as different field data to go out and find these things and get a good sense of, yeah, we're confident that this is a well that wasn't already on the list, etc. Sensor fusion and data integration. The big point there is, if you will even agree that there's 300,000 of these wells sitting out there, going out and physically touching every single one of these is going to be a very slow and laborious process. So this is where we want to leverage technologies that are measuring with multiple different instruments, etc., and layering that together to give you some sort of sense of where these things are. That takes, that's where we're going in the space of more advanced computing. What technologies do we need for this? Things like AI are going to show up in this space. Well characterization. Of course, once I've got this well, if I can give you guys, give information to the regulatory body, any sort of information about when that well was drilled, what the depth is, what the condition might be. Those are all useful things for any of the going forward plugging activities, especially if you're wanting to prioritize these wells beyond just saying, okay, it's emitting a certain amount of methane, it's within such and such a distance of a house or school or something like that. But if we want to know something else, what can we do that is cost effective and gets you some information? Again, this is going to involve both historical record scraping as well as in-field technologies. And then, of course, data management. So, as you can imagine, I've just identified a whole bunch of different data things that we want to go out and do. We're hoping to collect very large data sets, because anytime you want to play with AI, you're going to need large data sets to do that. So managing that data is an important thing. So how do we put that together in a reasonable framework? And then the last 3 are the new ones that we added this year with the additional $10 million funding. So we accelerated the data records extraction for historical data on its own. So that has now been spun off separate, because I'm sure you guys have heard about ChatGPT-3 in the news, and what it get some sense of what it can do. What it is good at doing is extracting out specific words and different phrases and things from documents that are in there. Well, a lot of old well data is scanned, sitting in flat images that are either PDFs or image or TIFF files. That's where this kind of technology can go in and start pulling them. We're working on that now. We're also working on building up what is essentially a national well database. Like, again, DOE doesn't own the data, that's the states and the regulatory bodies who own it. But what we're doing is we're putting together a database that can go out there and mine all those different sources and bring them into one spot. So we'll never be the ones that manage, make sure that the data gets changed the right way. But if you guys update your data, we'll be able to push a button. It's going to go out and pull the data again, pull it back in. And that way, we have as good an idea of where the wells we know about are, so that I'm not coming in and telling Bill that, oh, we found a whole bunch of wells, but they happen to be ones that you guys already know about. We don't want to be wasting time with that. And then the last one is the one I'll spend the most time talking about this afternoon, because we're doing this here in Osage County, is the field teams. So we set up pretty early on to recognize, okay, one, this is supposed to be an applied science program, right? We want to be making a measurable impact to citizens in the US. We also need to be collecting data, because otherwise we can't do some of the high-end things that we would like to do. And so what we did is put together a fund and say, who can we go out and talk to that can get us access to relatively large swaths of land that we could trade, essentially help do some of the methane measurements that they need for the DOI work, while we collect this data to try to find where other wells might be. And that's exactly what we ended up doing with the Osage. We ended up putting together a program where we can share that data. They have access to everything we're doing, but we also can use this as a test bed to start developing those large data sets that we're going to want to do to demonstrate how to find these things at scale. Because again, that is the main challenge of this problem, is that we're looking at, you want to throw 1 million wells out there, you don't know where they are, across, 23 states. That is a big scale problem. So we have to find tools that allow us to collect data over large areas, but at a high enough resolution to find essentials, right? And that's where, so to do that, we need big test areas. So with that, as I mentioned in Core Package 1, we're very busy with methane emission techniques, and so we are actively part of the methane emission programs that the guidelines that were put together for the DOI's program for methane emissions. So we're on the side of the technical bit, where we're going out with using lots of different tools and technologies, and how to make that measurement as good as possible at the right economic price and at the right speed, so it doesn't slow down the rates, because that's the other side of this thing. For the orphan well program, they are, once they start moving a rig in and start plugging wells, you don't want to be held up by a methane measurement that you didn't make or it wasn't good enough, because that's not very expensive relative to the cost of a rig. And so we're helping on with that. We're out there validating as much as we can, and just building up our general statistics about what do these wells emit over time. Like, if you looked at the entire population across the United States, what is the average methane emission, and what is that distribution look like? Another thing we were asked in the last November, explicitly by the White House, was to put together a very easy, cost-effective, and defensible method to go out and measure methane from a well, in case you didn't have access to all these other more high-end technologies, right? And this, kind of the origin of this is we had already gotten some feedback from some states where, again, they pay a contractor to go out and measure the emissions on a well. It was zero, so they moved on, but the rig moved on to plug this thing. Well, they do a methane check just with a concentration meter, and they detect methane, right? So they have to stop by the requirement and get a new measurement, and so that's going to hold up the process. So what we wanted was a process that a rig hand can do, as a means to get a good enough measurement for this with relatively cheap things. So basically what it is you're using a handheld anemometer to measure wind speed. You've got a small, cheap tool to measure concentration, and you're stepping a meter downwind from the source. And you're taking those measurements, and then we're putting that into a Gaussian plume model to back calculate a range of what the concentration could be. And is it perfect? No, but it's good enough to keep the process moving and still get a number that is worth reporting for these kind of wells. Yeah, and the next thing, so I mentioned the database. Again, this is something that is I showed you earlier the different federal entities that are involved. There's a lot of them. And so from our perspective, there's a need to have kind of a common talking point in terms of that data set. Because otherwise, everybody's always pulling from a slightly different data set, and you're going to end up with constant little discussion about whether or not we're correct just because are you querying from the right place at the right time. And so that's why we're focused on building it. But certainly there's other uses for this. There's been a lot of discussion today about carbon sequestration. You can imagine, in fact, I know the FECM folks that are doing carbon sequestration are interested in this as well, because again, they want to know where as many of these wells are as possible, so that if they start, working on a project, we're not doing a bunch of blowouts, right? So it's a project that's complicated, but I think it has big potential impact. And again, I've already talked about the large language models, or large language models. And again, what we're focused on primarily there is kind of two forms. You can do, like it shows here, a document where you extract text. But you can also do this with images, right? So you can train an AI to look for features in an image to indicate whether or not it's something that you care about. And so we're chasing both, right? So aerial photography, especially aerial photography through time, is very interesting to us. Another thing we've commonly been using are historic USGS topo maps. Because up till roughly, I think it was the 80s approximately, they used to mark when they saw wells. And so that's another little bit of mine information to find those kind of features. Unfortunately, there is no silver bullet to finding these guys. There's, not one technique is going to find every single undocumented orphan well. This map is actually a layer from, it's basically a section just north of the Pennsylvania border in New York. And what you're looking at is what? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different symbol styles. Those are from 5 different data sets that all can detect wells in some form or fashion. And of course, you can look at that and say, oh, well, it finds lots of wells, but they don't all match up perfectly. So there's another spot where we can help out too, is given the different layers of information we can collect, what is the uncertainty and probability range that we can give you in terms of how confident we think we are in that this is a real well there within a certain distance. And that's ultimately what a lot of our goal is to provide to the various regulatory bodies, is a map that does that, right? It's a probability map of here's where we think there's a well within this radius, and here are the techniques that detected it. And then that gives the regulatory bodies then the ability to make a decision on how they want to deal with that potential undocumented orphan well, because we won't target it. So, of course, as I mentioned, this is an applied science program, and one thing we want to be doing is being active out in the field. Because if we're not doing something that is useful to the folks in the field, then I don't feel we're necessarily being effective with our program. So here's a map of all the different places where we're active in some form or fashion. We're always looking for more, so if there's other places or people that are interested in talking about it, please let me know. But one thing we're pretty excited about is in the last year also, we were able to purchase some large-scale hybrid drones. They have roughly a 15-foot wingspan, and these things have an endurance range of something like 6 hours, right? That means potentially if these things, we're just now getting to test them, but they have the potential to scan multiple square miles in a day. That is now finally talking about in oil field space, right? Most drone work that you see today from a lot of folks is focused on quadcopters, and they're generally talking in the acre space, tens of acres. That's not going to cut it for this kind of program. So that's where we're, that's one of the areas that we're definitely moving forward with. So the rest of this, I'm just going to give you guys kind of a general overview of what we did in the Osage Nation just recently at the end of October. So as I mentioned, in August of 2023, we signed a memorandum of understanding so that we can work together to help find these wells, but at the same time, we can share our expertise on measuring methane so that they can use it for their DOI OWPO grants, as well as sharing information on the drones. I know that was something Bill was pretty interested in off the bat, is share all the data we've got so you guys can use it for other things, because I think this data will be useful for them. Let's see, and then yeah, so they received the grant, and this advances our goals and puts our first field visit was in October 2023. So the biggest thing I want to stress here is that at least from our perspective, we viewed it as a really big success, and that was very much owed to the fact that we had really good engagement from the Osage Nation themselves. So the Osage Mineral Council has been great to interact with. Having both, having the local input is important for this to be useful and to be impactful. On the plus side too, is like it gets the scientists that are out there coming up really excited. You're going to get a lot more out of them, and even you're going to be able to learn more just because somebody's showing interest in what they're doing and they love that. So that's what I got really excited about seeing. So in October, our goal was to start kind of small. We wanted to come out and test out some of our early drones. So it would be a quadcopter and one of our smaller fixed wing drones. Bill provided us with the reference, and we agreed to start out on the Osage Nation Ranch, this little green section here. There's the blow up. Again, we wanted to start in a place where there are known old wells that are probably leaking, that have various states of deconstruction. Essentially, some of them you might have just a wellhead, some you might have more facilities. Because when we do some of the aerial data collection, we want to see the noise that's generated in that space too. And then of course we sent out folks that were also doing ground truthing. So we had guys that were going out with GPS and handheld sniffers and actually measuring at each individual well as well. So that again, we can say, okay, we think we see a well with the aerial data, here we can back it up because we actually had somebody go out and measure exactly where it was. And so again, I was talking about that there's no silver bullet. You want to layer these data sets together. In this case, the examples we used or the data we had before we went out in the field were from the well database, the historical topographic maps. There are some older LiDAR data, as well as historic aerial photographs. And what you see here is all the little symbols. Those are basically well features that we can identify with each of those layers. And then we're going to stack them on top of each other. As I said, we sent, of course, that was the other learning for the trip. This was the 1 week in October where it was bad weather, right? We've had a really nice fall, but that week it was all rainy and windy, and so we were a little bit limited. But again, that was good learning. So one of the feedbacks is, okay, guys, plan for 2 weeks, and then that way you have a bailout week when the weather changes. It's 30 degrees here, and the next week it's 70, because that's Oklahoma. So here's what the quadcopters look like, as well as the smaller hybrid drones. These both have magnetometers on them, so we were able to scan 2 different techniques and be able to compare and contrast as well. So that was useful to us. Here's an example of what the data looks like from those. Of course, the quadcopter looks a lot cleaner. The big caveat I'd say is the small fixed wing drone was flying at like 30 mile-an-hour gusts. So it was actually doing really well. We get good usable data that can probably be filtered out, even in relatively poor flying conditions. And so we were pretty excited about that. We're excited to see how the larger drone performs as well. I don't know if you guys can see them, but if you can see the little black dots, those are the locations as reported by the database from the Osage Mineral Council. And then of course the red bullseyes, that's a magnetic anomaly. So we would expect them to line up. There's been some that after checking, the data set might be a little bit off, which makes sense, and some of these wells are pretty old. So, GPS wasn't always around. Other features that we saw that we were able to get, detection, but not to the same strength, were some of the surface things that were sitting out there in this area. There's a tank battery, it looks like, and then some valving, surface valves. As you can see, they don't show up as strongly, which is good, so we can, again, start using that as a way to train for what is likely a well, what is not. Ground survey, so in the same area. So again, on the right side, you have the magnetic anomaly data with the database points. On the left side here, now all you're seeing is the overlay of where somebody, while we were out there, went and physically put a GPS unit on that well. So we were able to say for sure there are wells there. And then we can look at the overlay. He didn't get to all the wells within the section in that time, which is another good indicator of how long it can take to do that. Right? So again, that's the scaling issue we're dealing with. But for example, of leaking wells, and this is PDF, so I don't have the movie. This image on the left side is actually, this is a movie, and you can actually see it, burping out of the little hole that it's leaking. And then, so there's 3 measurements here, for example. We saw some, this one with the movie is the far left, top left, and that was doing roughly 8 grams an hour. The next one down is about 50 grams an hour. And then this picture of this well, just this open well head that's down in the kind of the bottom middle, that was doing 800 grams an hour. So we saw distinct variability over that area, which is good for us. And it's telling us that, that's a pretty wide range of performance just in a relatively small area in terms of how much these wells are emitting. So future work, the team is definitely busy collecting or working with the data that they got. And they're excited and we're actively working with the Osage Mineral Council to come back out and do a larger, more advanced survey as soon as possible. So this is an ongoing process, and it's exciting from our side. That is one of the nice benefits of the nice cold weather. This guy was sitting right there where they were flying the drone, but since it's nice and cold, he wasn't too angry about it. So that makes life a little easier. Last thing I want to tie up before we get to questions is I'll again mention the methane emissions reduction program. So this thing is really just getting going. It's a big program, like I said, $1.5 billion. And it is still being announced in terms of phases and things like that. So it is developing as going, but I think it's something you guys will want to keep an eye on, because certainly it's a target-rich environment for the Osage for this kind of stuff as well. And so if you guys can take advantage of it, I encourage you to do that. Last, again, there's my contact information, and you can also find me on the catalog website. And with that, I'm interested in hearing questions from folks. Thank you.
Hi, I'm not a producer or a shareholder. I'm a reporter. I work for Osage News, and I just had a question about the database.
How you doing?
Talk into the mic.
So what? Still working? It says dead battery. You guys hear me? Yeah. Okay. So the question was, is any of the DOI, as I believe it would be the DOI or WPO money, so the grant money for that, is it going to be used for improving the Osage Mineral Council's database? Bill, you guys would have to answer that. I wouldn't. So what DOE is offering is there's no cost to the Osage Nation. Right? We're bringing our money with us. What we're wanting to do is collect data. Right? But I would defer to Bill or Candy or somebody on if there's any plans going further updating the Osage database.
Of course, we want to update the database and what you were looking at there are the visual wells provided to us. We went through 1 year doing the process. And so, yeah, we'll take all the information usually for canyons and the trees and things like that. But you'll get one of these wells will move or actually not. So, like he showed, go ahead and every time somebody gets a measurement, it's usually well moved somewhere else. And the first well I plugged, probably 800 feet away from where the well was, the actual well. They're out there to find wells that we have passed.
No, that's for the nation. That's the estimate. That's the estimate produced by the IOGCC for the nation. And if you go to their report, they break it down by state. Basically, they ask each state to make an estimate. One thing I couldn't tell you off the top of my head is when that estimate was made, we did the city, the Osage, and Oklahoma made the estimate. I'd have to go back. On that 1/4 mile, or sorry, 1 square mile, I think we found 2 for sure. Or 2 like. We have to submit the data to Bill, and he can tell you whether or not it's actual or not. Because we don't do it. An orphan is defined by having no owner or operator that's responsible for it. So that's a regulatory definition of that. We're not going to touch. What we're going to do is, like I said, provide data and evidence for there is a well. We don't see it any of the databases that has information behind what do you want to do with it. And that's as far as DOE has released. We don't have any other questions?
So quantifying the amount of methane that's escaping us, is there, are you able to do, have you been able to do any of that?
Yeah, so they measured, I want to say, was it 20 or 22 wells out there on that section? And I know we're already trying to set up, so one of the scientists from North Berkeley Labs, this is what he does for most of his work. He was telling me he's trying to coordinate a time to come back, and they're talking roughly 300 to come back. These are no wells. Why do we want to know what these no wells are in? Is because that gives us an idea of what orphan wells might be. And it allows us to put them into, say, categories, right? Wells that are emitting, say, a gram an hour is emitting roughly what a cow would do. So you probably don't want to spend a ton of money and effort on that well right now. Whereas ones that are emitting over a kilogram, that's a significant amount of methane coming out over the course of a year. You probably want to, that would probably be the well I would recommend you go with 12, barring any other information. They can leak other things, right? There's other reasons or ways to prioritize.
So you haven't quantified those 22 wells?
No, we have. So they measured this.
They haven't?
They saw, so the average range, I believe, I don't know if I have it in there, was roughly 1 gram an hour to about 40. That was the average for most, with the big outlier being that 800 gram an hour. Another thing I should add, so something we're really interested in looking at over the next couple of years is that wells don't emit methane at a constant rate. They're going to vary over time, which makes sense. So the question becomes, how good or what is the uncertainty of any point measurement that you make? So if I go out there one day and measure it at 10 grams an hour, what is the average plus or minus that it could be doing over the course of the year? That becomes very important because we're relying primarily on point measurements for a lot of this work because we don't have the time to set tools out there that are long. So we're looking at areas and we're identifying wells that we can set up and do those kind of long-term measurements to give us that range. We've done that on some, and what we're seeing roughly is an order of magnitude. What does that mean? That means that you got a well that was doing 10, then conceivably the average is statistically somewhere between 1 and 100, right? And so it's getting down to the gnat's eyelash is not probably the most important part for this. It's understanding how to where in that scale your mission proceed.
So is your database publicly available?
It will be. It's still being brought up to speed. So it'll the database I've referenced right now will be posted on what NETL called EDX. I don't know if we have a version yet that's public facing. We're still working on it, but that is the intent.
You know how long it'll take you to be able to get that?
So I have been pushing them hard to get a version that I get to look at the end of this year. So I'm hoping maybe in 6 months, Stace, but don't hold me to it. Or hold me to it and I can blame it on the check.
Is that Indian?
That's a hard number to pin down. It's highly variable across the nation, especially if you want an average location versus someone else. I don't know what that, so a place to go look. So just in the last couple of weeks, the Overwell Program Office published their first year on what they've been doing. So they, through the Overwell Program Office, in the last year, they plugged 7,000 wells. I have not read the entire thing, so I don't remember if they have posted their average cost or any sort of breakdown of that. But I know they are working on tracking it. It's probably a better place for you to get that from than for me just throwing it out. Any other questions? All right, thank you.
I think what time is it, 4 o'clock? It says orphan well. I thought it was possible. I know.
Okay, guys, next up is Stacy Taruccio. I hope I said that right. Let's take about a 10-minute break. She's going to need a little time to get set up, so about 10 minutes. We're way ahead of schedule, so about close to 3:30 we'll get kicked off again. Thank you.
I thought we was out around there.
You saw the over so it's 2 phases. Travel, third party costs. Travel expenses are quite a bit. Billed for hours.
Good. They're good. Mason just is really nice to let them work when you're here. We just came over to Mexico. I just stayed longer than you stayed at all. My other son is working with his dad. But you weren't coming to the meetings anymore. We do get tired of it. We do need we need to try to share right. They have it. We just keep sliding back. It's not a good deal. I don't go back as often. I want to just I didn't. You're going to do something? But there, I mean, I hate that too, but I can't think of, Bryce, I don't think there's a about there. And if you do, then, I mean, if you have that, good. But mostly, if you do, you make it outright. But I do make it. I wish I'd have been there. Right, yeah. Yeah, that's cool. To see how this training works out.